Almost as soon as Donald Trump stepped off the stage from his inauguration, he started violating his constitutional oath of office. That has led a lot of people to say we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
Paige, there is so much going on in court. It is almost hard for you and I on a daily basis to figure out where to start. But I think we need to take a step back and address the big elephant in the room, which is people's concerns that Donald Trump issued unlawful orders, that he issued a series of unlawful executive orders, that there have been illegal policy memos, that you've got random, kids recently out of high school running around the federal government accessing systems. And the big thing on people's mind is not just, is this legal? Is this constitutional? But is it worse than that?
The term we're hearing a lot is a constitutional crisis. Is America approaching one? Are we already in one? How do we get out of it? So Mark, how would you define a constitutional crisis? And are we in one right now?
Yeah, so I'll lead with the headline, which is that I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis. I think we are on the precipice of a constitutional crisis. And I think there's an important distinction. To me, it is not a constitutional crisis when the executive branch, the president of the United States, does something illegal and it is stopped, right? I mean, the system of checks and balances works when one branch oversteps and they are stopped from overstepping by the other co-equal branches of government. It is despicable. It is authoritarian. It is, loathsome. It is everything that we worry about with Donald Trump, that he oversteps power. But it's not a constitutional crisis. What makes it a constitutional crisis is when the branches of government are unable to contain it. In other words, when one branch usurps power that does not belong to themselves and it goes unchecked. And so the reason why I say we are on the precipice of a constitutional crisis, but not in one, is because the federal judiciary is in fact doing its job. The federal judiciary is in fact holding hearings and saying that what Donald Trump wants to do is not legal and it has to stop. Federal judges all across the ideological spectrum, from those appointed by Donald Trump to those appointed by Barack Obama, by Joe Biden, by George Bush, even by Ronald Reagan. They have all heard cases. They have all put in place court orders that say that what Donald Trump is trying to do and what Elon Musk and others are trying to do is illegal or unconstitutional, and it has to stop. So that is not actually a constitutional crisis. That's actually our constitutional system. It may be messy. It may be worrisome to people. It may be causing high levels of anxiety. But when you have federal judges halting illegal actions, that isn't a crisis. That is actually the system as it is designed to work. Now, why do I say we're on a precipice? Because we are starting to see signs. We are starting to hear statements. We are starting to read social media posts that some within the executive branch, some, whether it's the White House or people around the president, including potentially the vice president, are suggesting that maybe they don't need to abide by court orders. Now, if we get to that, if we get to the point in which you have an administration that says we don't need to abide by lawful orders of federal judges, then we will be in a full-blown constitutional crisis.
So Mark, let's focus on that for a bit. Over the weekend, Vice President J.D. Vance posted on X, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Elon Musk, Tom Cotton, Stephen Miller all joined in on the same sentiment, saying that it was overreach to have one district judge issue a nationwide injunction or TRO. We are assuming this is in reference to the OMB memo case in Rhode Island, where a federal judge there issued a block on the OMB memo to freeze federal grants and loans. The judge said that those payments should resume. And in fact, the DOJ came back and said, we don't really think that this order applies to us. It doesn't apply to most of these federal agencies. They don't need to listen to you. The judge came back very forcefully and said, no, my order is very clear. The federal government can't pause any payments right now. So by your own definition, are we now in a constitutional crisis if you have the DOJ and other members of the executive branch saying that they don't need to listen to that judge's order?
Well, so first of all, I'm not sure if they were referring to that or whether they were referring to the case in New York, where a federal judge put a block on who can tinker around in the Treasury Department systems. That was done on Friday night. By the way, they could also be talking about the federal judge appointed by Donald Trump, who also on Friday night into Saturday morning said that they had to reinstate or not put on administratively people from USAID. So
Or
this
maybe it's about the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship cases where multiple judges across the country issued nationwide blocks on that executive order.
Right. So I don't want to minimize what's going on. And I don't want to suggest that it's just one judge, one place that's having a disagreement with the Department of Justice lawyers. This is a systemic problem in which you have federal judges all around the country saying that, number one, what's happening here is not legal or constitutional, but number two, are having to come back and say, I don't think that my orders are being entirely heard clearly and listened to. But here is why I don't think it is yet a constitutional crisis. The Department of Justice lawyers in these cases are not saying, Your Honor, we don't have to listen to your order. They're saying we construed your order to mean X. Now, there is a fine line sometimes between these two things, but which is why there's a fine line between these two things, which is the reason why people say, a constitutional crisis is not an on-off switch. It's more like a continuum, right? And that's why I say we're on the precipice of it, because there is still the position of the U.S. government being that federal judges do have authority to hear these cases. Federal judges do have authority to rule in these cases. Federal judges do have authority to issue orders blocking or compelling certain action in these cases. What you're getting from the Department of Justice so far is, we think that what you meant was less than what you say you meant. Now, again, this can be a continuum of when something is being obtuse and when someone is being willfully defiant, but we are still in the realm of the lawyers for the federal government and the federal government itself still acting or still saying that it believes that courts have this authority. What you mentioned about Vice President Vance and some of that starts to tip over that line, because they seem to be suggesting, not stating it outright, not stating it in clear, unequivocal terms, but suggesting outright that actually the problem is not the clarity of the order, but whether the court has the authority to issue the order at all. And that is where you would get a full-blown constitutional crisis. So let's use an example. What would happen if a federal judge said you have to stop defunding X, and the Department of Justice filed a notice saying, we've got that order, not paying attention to it? Okay, now we're into a different category of situation, and that I think would be much more serious, and that would be a constitutional crisis.
Mark, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit kind of on what Republicans or the Trump administration's motivations behind all of this would be. Because I think we all learned, the US has three branches of government. It is the job of the judiciary to check the legislative and executive branches and say whether or not their actions are constitutional. You have the judiciary doing just that, right? They're looking at the actions of the executive branch and saying that's unconstitutional or that breaks federal law. Where are Republicans getting the chutzpah to come up and say that's actually not your job and you're overstepping your power?
Yeah, Paige, I think like many things with the administration, they have not thought this all the way through. So I think that there is a strain of people in the administration and a strain of conservative thought, including among some judges and justices, that the executive branch is very powerful. Sometimes this is referred to as the unitary executive theory, but that essentially the president controls the executive branch and his whim governs all of the executive branch. And look, there are some adherents on the Supreme Court to that, to something akin to that envisions a very strong president. What that is, though, is the power of the president relative to his subordinate officers, his attorney general, his independent agencies. That is quite different than what we are seeing being argued by J.D. Vance, or maybe being argued by J.D. Vance, maybe being argued by Elon Musk and others, which is the power of the president relative to the courts. And I got to tell you, there's no appetite on the Supreme Court for that fight. There's no, or for that position, I should say. There's no appetite for anyone in the judiciary to say that what a strong president or a unitary executive means is that courts don't get to weigh in. It may be that independent agencies don't get to act independently, but the idea that federal courts can be disregarded, that I think they're going to not find many takers on. And that is a very, very, very fringe legal theory. Like, that is not within the mainstream of conservative judges or conservative lawyers. And I think that in their sort of moments of feeling all powerful, they are confusing these two things, and they will not enjoy the support among even conservative justices that they may think they are going to have.
So, Mike, we've talked about the executive, we've talked about the judiciary, the third branch of government, legislative. Where is Congress in all of that? What is their reaction? What is their role if the executive branch is taking actions that to, withhold funds that Congress has appropriated or violated laws that Congress has passed?
All right. Where is Congress? I think they're hiding. I think that the Republicans are hiding. I think that Speaker Johnson is hiding. I think John Thune is hiding. I think that Republicans in Congress could be playing a very important role here for the reasons you say. The fact that I did an entire discussion of the checks and balances between the branches of government and we never mentioned Congress probably tells you where Congress is, which is that Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, and they don't want to do anything that even mildly displeases Donald Trump. I mean, they have completely forfeited their constitutional role in this to Donald Trump. And I want to say this very clearly, looking to all of the people watching this video. Stop blaming the Democrats. Democrats don't control either House of Congress. Okay, the Republicans control Congress. Focus your attention on the people who are to blame here. That is Speaker Johnson. That is John Thune. And don't let them divert your attention someplace else, because Paige, they are not playing a role. And if you had a congressional leadership that was looking out for their own prerogatives, this constitutional crisis would be much further out in the distance than it is, because you would have Congress itself holding oversight hearings. You'd have Congress itself objecting to being cut out of this process. You'd have Congress itself saying, you don't have the power to not spend money that we have appropriated. You don't have the power to fire people where we have created protections for them, right? This would not be a constitutional crisis, because you'd have a legislative branch sticking up for its prerogatives, and the judiciary would not be having to bear all this weight. But we don't have that Congress. We have a cowardly Republican conference in the House, a cowardly Republican conference in the Senate, and that is part of why we're in the situation we're in which this very much feels like a stalemate just between the executive branch and the courts.
So, Mark, that's all in the federal government, but what about the states? Do the states have a role to play in an impending constitutional crisis?
Yeah, they do. It's funny. Every time there's a Democratic president, we hear a lot from Republicans about federalism. And then when Donald Trump's president, like, all of a sudden, like, federalism, what is that? So states? Do the states do something? Right? Yeah, of course the states play a big role. I mean, we live in a federal system. There are state courts, there are federal courts, there are authorities of the federal government and authorities of the state government. And states have an important role here. And you are seeing states attorneys general, Democratic attorneys general, at least, standing up for their states in court, in federal court. But you're also seeing governors play an important role here. And so I suspect that in the days to come, we are going to see even more of this conflict between the states and the federal government than we have seen so far. And so that is among the many, many reasons why everyone out there needs to make sure they are subscribed to Democracy Docket. You can get free daily and weekly newsletters. It keeps you informed on all of this by clicking the link above or in the show notes below. And if you want even more premium content, become a paying member. We'll see you next time.